tundra that I like to call home, Saginaw, Michigan. I have a really exciting story to tell you today, and it's from a book that was printed in 1852, and it is called Adventures of the Ojibbeway and Ioway Indians in England, France, and Belgium, being notes of 8 years' travels and residence with his North American Indian collection, and this was written by George Catlin. So I want to share this story with you. I think you're going to be fascinated. I know I was. In the fall of the year 1839, I embarked at New York on board of a packet ship, Rossius, Captain Collins for Liverpool, with my Indian collection, having received a very friendly letter of advice from Honorable C.A. Murray, Master of Her Majesty's Household, who had formerly been a fellow traveler with me on the Mississippi and other rivers in America, and who on his return to London had kindly made a conditional arrangement for my collection in the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly. I intended to convey to the English people an accurate account of the appearance and condition of the North American tribes of Indians, and so on board ship as we were crossing, as part of my heavy collection and as further illustration of the rude inhabitants of the far west, I had in a huge iron cage 2 grizzly bears from the Rocky Mountains, forming not only the heaviest and most awkward part of my freight, but altogether the most troublesome, as will be seen hereafter. Wow. The wind was kind to us and soon drove us across the Atlantic without more than an incident or two worth recording, which I had minuted down as follows. About the middle of the ocean, and in the midst of 4 or 5 days' heavy gale, we came suddenly upon a ship partly dismasted, with signals of distress flying and waterlogged, rolling about at the mercy of the merciless waves. We rounded to with great danger to our own craft, and during the early part of the night succeeded with much difficulty in taking off the captain and crew of 28 men just before the ship went down. This was a common occurrence, however. Common occurrence, however, and needs no further notice other than a feature or two which struck me as somewhat new. When the poor jaded and water-soaked fellows were all safely landed on the deck of our vessel, they lay down upon their faces and devoutly thanked God for their deliverance. And last of all, that was lifted on board from their jolly boat was their keg of rum, the only thing which they had brought with them when they desired to desert ship. This, good Captain Collins said, you will not want now, my boys, and he cast it into the sea. Oh, my goodness. Captain James, a bland and good-natured Scotsman, commander of the Scotia, the unfortunate vessel, was invited by Captain Collins to the cabin of the Rossius and into his stateroom, where he was soon put into a suite of dry and warm clothes, and afterwards seated at the captain's table, where suddenly a sullen resistance to food and contemplative tears rolling over his cheeks showed his rough shell to contain a heart that was worthy of the fondest affections of my dear wife and sweet little ones, none of which he blessed with, if I recollect correctly. But when his grief found utterance, he exclaimed, "My God, I have left my poor dog tied to the mast of my old craft. There he is, poor fellow. And when we took to the jolly boat, I never thought of my poor Pompey." And the briny tears seemed to burn this veteran's hardened features as they ran over his cheeks, and hunger and fatigue and all gave way to them and a grief, until sleep had dried them up and taken the edge from his anguished mind. Now the next morning, his recital of the affectionate deeds of the life of his faithful dog, who had made 18 voyages across the Atlantic Ocean with him, and who would always indicate land ahead by his nose sooner than sailors could discern it from the masthead, whom he had in kindness lashed to the mast of his for his safety, and in carelessness abounded to his unavoidable fate, brought tears of pity in my own eyes. Poor man! We were at this time still in the midst of a terrible gale, which was increasing in its fury and had already become quite too much for taste and the stomach of the Grizzlies, a few words more of whom must go into this chapter. These 2 awkward voyagers from the base of the Rocky Mountains, which I had reared from cubs and fed for more than 4 years, for whose roughness in clawing and chawing I had paid for half a dozen cages which they had demolished and escaped from, and the prices of as many dogs used up in retaking them had now grown to the enormous size of 8 or 10 pounds each, requiring a cage of iron so large that it could not be packed amongst the ship's cargo below, but must needs occupy considerable space on deck in the form of a size somewhat of a small house. Now the front of the cage was formed of huge iron bars, and kindly indulging the Bruins to amuse themselves with a peep at what was progressing on deck, whilst it afforded the sailors steerage passengers the amusement of looking at and commenting upon the physiognomy and mood. I'm sorry, folks, I'm not as educated as some might think. And maneuvers of these rude specimens from the wilderness of America. This huge cage, with its inmates, had ridden into and partly through the gale with us, when the bears became subjects of more violent interest and excitement than we had yet anticipated and could have possibly wished for. What had taken and was taking place amongst the sick and frightened group of passengers during this roaring, whistling, thrashing, and dashing gale was commonplace and has been 1,000 times described, but the seasickness and rage and fury of these two grisly denizens of the deep ravines of the rocky crags of the Rocky Mountains were subject, as fresh as they were, frightful and appalling to the terrified crew and passengers who were about them, and therefore deserving passing comment. The immediate guardian of these animals was a faithful man by the name of Daniel Cavanaugh, who had for several years been in my employment as curator of my collections and designed to accompany me in my tour through England. Now, this man had occupied a conspicuous place in my affairs in Europe, and much will be said of him in the following pages, and the familiar and brief cognomen of Daniel or Dan applied to him. On embarking with this man and his troublesome pets at New York, I had fully explained to Captain Collins their ferocious and deceitful and intractable nature, who had consequently issued his orders to all of his crew and to the steerage passengers not to venture within their reach or to trifle with them. And notwithstanding all of this precaution, curiosity, that beautiful trait of human nature which often becomes irresistible in long voyages, and able to turn the claws of the devil himself into the soft, tapering fingers of the Venus or Daphne, got the better of the idle hours of the sailors, who were amusing themselves and the passengers in front of the iron bars by believing that they were wearing off by a sort charm the rough asperities of their grisly and grim passengers by shaking their paws and squaring and fending off awkward sweeps occasionally made by the huge paw of the she-bear. Of course, the he-bear would never do anything like that. Right? Anyways, of the she-bear, which she could effectually make by lying down and running her right arm quite out between the iron bars. And one of these, now going to be amusing occasions, one of the sailors was squared off before the cage, inviting her grisly majesty to a sort of set to, when she, seemingly aware of the nature of the challenge, gradually extended her arm and her huge paw and a little further out of her cage, with her eyes capriciously closed until it was to its fullest extent, when she made a side lick at his head and an exceedingly awkward one for the sailor to parry. It was lucky for him, poor fellow, that he partly dodged it, though as her paw passed in front of his face, one of her claws carried away entirely his nose, leaving it falling down and hanging over his mouth, suspended merely by a small piece of skin or gristle by which alone he could claim it. Oh my goodness. Here was a sudden check to the familiarity with the bears, the result of which were a renewal of the orders of non-intercourse from Captain Collins and a marked coolness, get your minds out of the gutter, and a marked coolness between the sailors and steerage passengers and the Gearsleys during the remainder of the voyage. A sailor was committed to the care of Dr. Madden in the cabin, the distinguished traveler in Africa and West Indies, and now one of our esteemed fellow passengers, who skillfully replaced, and arranged his nose with stitches and splints and attended to it during the voyage. The poor fellow continued to swear vengeance on the bears when they should reach land. But I believe that when they were landed in Liverpool, his nose was not sufficiently secure to favor his design. This unlucky affair had happened some days previous to the gale, which I have begun to describe, and with the unsociable and cold reserve with which they were subsequently treated by all on board, visited only at stated periods by their old but not yet confiding friend Daniel, who brought them their daily allowance. They had, as I mentioned, become partakers and sufferers with us in the pangs and fears of the hurricane that was sweeping over the vessel and the sea about us. And that's the end of part one. When I come back, we will look at the third day of the storm on the sea. I hope you're enjoying this. I'm enjoying going over it again with you. And I will see you all again real soon, God willing. Love you all very much on the other side of that monitor. God bless you, and stay well, safe, happy, and warm. Hasta la vista.